this video we're going to be getting into some of the basics of CSS. So I'm going to be writing some notes up here on the page, and then later we're going to come back in and style this recipe site that I made just using some simple HTML. So if you haven't watched it, check out our intro to HTML video. This is where we have created sort of this simple recipe page. Currently it's completely unstyled, so it's just plain HTML. We're going to see how we can use CSS to style a page like this. So without further ado, let's jump right in. And first of all, we're going to talk about what exactly is CSS. So what is CSS? Well, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Style Sheets. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, you just need to know that it's basically, think of it as sort of a language. So language to style and lay out web pages, essentially. Right, so if we take another quick look at this simple HTML web page, it doesn't have any styling. Right, this is just the default styling that is applied for our HTML. Right, look at this thing like a list. We have a header, we have an image, we have some text down here, but it's all styled. It's unstyled. So if you've ever had a page load up before online and it looks kind of like this, chances are for some reason the CSS might have failed to load. So CSS is largely used all over the place. It's a really critical part of making any sort of web page. Right? Otherwise, all web pages out there would look like some variation of this. So this means you can use it to style, things like the font, color, spacing, layout of page. You can even do things like animations, and even other decorative features. So for example, if you hover over an element, you can do something like make that element bigger, or change the color of the font, change the background image. There's all sorts of neat things you can do with CSS. Right, and just to write out another note here, CSS, again, it's a language for figuring out what your document should look like. So language for styling your document and determining how it is presented. Right? And you can think of your document as HTML, for example. That's one type of document you can use CSS with. Right? In HTML, it's what's known as a markup language. So you mark it all up with HTML and then you style it up using CSS. So how does that work exactly? Well, let's make a new bullet point here. So how can we alter the appearance of HTML with CSS? Well, basically how it works is when you load up your HTML, the browser does a lot of hard work for us. So not only does it kind of parse out the HTML and present it in a way that makes sense, right? So just as a quick example, we have some HTML here. For example, this paragraph. Where is the paragraph? Here, this paragraph. Right, so we sandwiched it between p tags, and the browser interprets that for us, and it gives us the following result. Right, it formats it for us. So after it does that, it also looks for any style elements. So do we have an external CSS file, or do we have some kind of declaration inside of style tags telling us how to lay out our site? Right, so again, the web browser does a lot of work for us. So the web browser looks for CSS rules, is what they're known as. And these rules will kind of grab out pieces of HTML to kind of set properties on them. So you can think of a CSS rule as like this. So let me indent this. What's a CSS rule? Well, it's formed from a couple of things. First of all, there is a selector. And this is essentially, let me just add that in, essentially selects the HTML element or elements you want to style. Right? So there's a selector. So you say, okay, I want to style this particular piece of the page. And then what properties you want to apply to style it. Right? So properties which you want to change. Properties which you want to change. So again, as a quick example, let's say we have this section here, this entire section, and we want to change it somehow. So if we look on our page, that's the section where we have a bunch of just kind of lorem ipsum text. So there's all sorts of things we can do with CSS. One example is, let's say we wanted to make the background color different for this entire section. Well, we would use a combination of these two things. So we would say, okay, I want to grab that section using a selector, and I want to set the background color property to a different color, for example. And that is essentially how we can style out our page. So as you can imagine, CSS files can get pretty complex, but they can also be pretty simple, right? You can only grab certain pieces if you only want, and then style those pieces. And really, it's usually about kind of slowly building out a CSS file. So you kind of change your file as you go, keep an eye on it, see what's changing, see what works, see what doesn't. And you do a lot of that with what are known as CSS declarations. So CSS declarations. And CSS declarations really are where you set the CSS properties to specific values. And really this is, this is the main function of the CSS language, is doing this. And like any other language, it takes a while to learn the language, but then once you get comfortable with CSS, you can do some pretty cool stuff. Let's take a quick look at what a CSS rule looks like. What's a selector? What do properties look like? And essentially, it's going to look something like this. So we have different ways of grabbing the elements in CSS that we'll explore later. But if you just want to see a simple example of a CSS rule, it would look something like this. So, you grab some element, and then inside a block, so inside these curly brackets, this is where you set the property you want to change and what you want to change it to. Whoops, I misspelled element. So this would be the selector. And like I say, there's different ways of grabbing it. You can grab it via the ID or a different attribute. But in any case, you grab out your element somehow in your CSS. And then the way you can set the property, it's basically property name colon property value. So there's lots and lots of different properties out there. So your best bet just starting off is just to kind of Google it. So if you're trying to do a specific thing with CSS, for example, if you want to change the background color, just Google how to change background color with CSS. A lot of them are pretty straightforward as well. CSS, you can use hyphens. So for example, I happen to know offhand that background-color is the way you would change the background color of an element. Right, so notice background-color, and then you can put in, there's different ways of putting in the color. So you could just key in something like blue. You can use an RGB value, for example, red, green, blue. So I'm not sure offhand, but if we wanted to do blue, for example, we could do 00255. Right, if you're not too familiar with RGB values, you can kind of look up online on a color picker. It'll give you different options for how to see the color. RGB is one way. You can also use hex values. So, this usually looks something like F something something something, bunch of letters and numbers. And again, you can just kind of Google color pickers and it'll give that to you. But just starting out, I would recommend just kind of using plain solid colors like, teal or red. This way, this element's background color, assuming we grabbed it out correctly in our CSS selector, which is this piece, and assuming our property is correct, it's going to apply this property. Now, if you do make a mistake and you notice and you don't notice it, it's not going to break anything. It just won't know what to do here. It just won't apply this this property. Right? And in any given element, you don't have to do one change at a time. So let's say you wanted to do a whole bunch of things on some element. So change the background color and also maybe change the font size. And font size as well, I just happen to know, it looks like this. This is the property, font size, colon, and then you can change the font size in different ways as well. So you can use percentages, you can use things like pixels. So for example, if you wanted your font size to all be 50 pixels, it would look like this. And again, just starting out, I would recommend just kind of tinkering with pixels. This is how you can set, kind of common font size inside this element. So it's not uncommon to see, let me actually redo this. It's not uncommon to see a whole bunch of properties being set at once on some element, and that's just part of CSS. That's something you'll be doing quite a lot.